All right, let's turn the music down and go live here. I'm gonna wait for a few minutes in case more people show up. All righty, let me turn this music down. Go live. Hello, everyone. Just gonna wait for a couple minutes. I know it's a new channel, so not a lot of people are gonna watch anyway, but still give it a few minutes for people to straggle in. Welcome to Unsafe Space. I am your host, Carter Laren. Let's see. I guess while we're waiting for people, I can describe a little bit about why I'm doing this. In particular, why I'm going to start doing. I think I'm going to start doing these Tuesday tea times, just for the hell of it. But the idea behind them is to talk about the application of universal ethical principles, which I know sounds really boring, but it's super important. And here's why. When you look at, let's take for example the believe all women mantra that the left shouted at us a lot when during the Kavanaugh confirmation. This is an example of kind of an obvious ethical principle that really doesn't stand if you apply it universally to everyone. And Western civilization is actually built on the philosophy of the Enlightenment. It's built on this concept of universal ethics, right? Instead of the divine right of kings, it's built on this concept of universal ethics. John Locke's one of the key thinkers from the Enlightenment that talked about the universal application of ethics. And if you want your children to live in a society where they have rights, free speech rights, property rights, a world in which they're treated fairly and rules are applied equally to everyone, then you need to support the universal application of ethics, right? This is just kind of a foundation, a foundational cornerstone of America and how America was built and what America's institutions rely on. And the left, well, I'll say Marxists or postmodernists, they're the same thing. Basically, all the postmodernists are Marxists. The left has basically made a concerted effort to abandon this concept of universal ethics. And instead, what they'll do is just try and use whatever, quote, they'll throw together a principle, quote, principle, to kind of win an argument for of the day, whatever the argument is. So if it's that they don't want Kavanaugh confirmed, well, then it's believe all women. But of course, that's an easy one to see through, right? Because if you just apply that to, for example, what was her name? Karen Monahan, I think, Keith Ellison's accuser. Of course, they don't want it applied to her. And it's really important, I think, for people to understand that these kind of ideas, abstract them, universalize them so that you can kind of see through them. And it's really easy to do, but it does take a little bit of practice. And some of them, like that one, like believe all women's, very easy. And that's obvious. Also, if you happen to this really useful in raising my daughter, things like, for example, let's say we agreed that she promised to brush her teeth and go to bed without much of a fuss if I read another chapter in a book, right, when she was little. Well, if I read the chapter and then she was like, I don't want to brush my teeth, and I say, well, and she starts to, and I remind her of her promise, and she says like, oh, I changed my mind, or I don't want to, or but I don't feel like it, right? It was a great parenting technique. Actually, it was really easy for me to just say, well, okay, fine, like that's fine. That could be the new rule. We'll just apply it universally, right? And I wouldn't maybe use these words. Fine. So promises don't mean anything. That means the next time I make a promise to you, I can break it because I don't feel like it. So if I say you can have a cookie if you eat your green beans and you eat your green beans, I can just decide to change my mind. And promises aren't something that we will accept. And of course, even when she was really young, I might have to give more examples when she was really young, but when she was really young, it was a very obvious way to, oh, well, I don't want that. I'll just brush my teeth and not make a fuss. Like, that's a horrible universal rule that I just came up with, right? So you take something and you universalize it, and you can demonstrate how how it falls apart very easily. So I'm going to get started here and do this. I'm going to talk about three things, and I'm going to do this every Tuesday. I'd be happy. I'd love suggestions. I know the show is kind of just starting, and I don't have a lot of over the coming weeks. I'm hoping I get some suggestions or examples from people that you want to talk about, so we can kind of discuss how to unpack some of the craziness and apply, really in an effort to demonstrate that it's the opposite of to be, right? It seems to be something moral. It's actually something completely immoral that will destroy society. So you can tweet those suggestions to unsafe show. Post them on YouTube and let me know. So today I'm just going to try and cover three things. One is Warren, my favorite Indian. She's Cherokee, if you didn't know. So I'm going to cover that. And that one's an easy one, I think. And I'm going to actually call Antifa's characterized attacks on people as self-defense, and I got into it with some Antifa supporters on Twitter recently, and it really made me think about this. I'm actually reading the Antifa handbook right now, and also going to talk about some things that Hillary Clinton said universally. So here we go. Let's see here. All right, number one, Elizabeth Warren. So you probably know Elizabeth Warren. She claimed that she was Cherokee, right? And Trump then made fun of her for this because, look, she's blonde hair, blue eyes. She looks white as bed sheets or whatever. She's like, she doesn't look at all Native American. And not only President Trump mocked her for it, but Native American tribes, the Cherokee tribes and Native Americans have been complaining that she's misrepresenting herself. And so she really one up everyone and show, yes, I am Native American. You'll see. And she put out a video and that showcases her journey with a geneticist from Stanford. I don't remember his name. And he basically ran a genetics test on her. And the results of the test are that she is that one ancestor between 6 and 10 generations ago may have been Native American, sort of. I mean, it was the pool that they used was like involved some South American DNA, so it's not totally clear, but let's assume that that's fine and it's Native American ancestry. So one person 6 to 10 generations ago, that puts her percentage of Native American DNA at between 0.098% and 1.56%. So just to give you some context here, I think the average European American in the U.S. Has 0.18% Native American DNA. So they would fall right in the middle of Elizabeth Warren's range of what DNA she has that makes her Native American. Now, obviously, this shouldn't be an issue. I don't really care how much Native American blood Elizabeth Warren has, and I doubt anyone else does, except for the fact that she is touting it, and she's representing herself as Cherokee. And she'll say, well, that wasn't used in getting any jobs. Maybe not. But she did acknowledge that she listed herself as Native American on both the Harvard University and Pennsylvania, or University of Pennsylvania. Both those universities, she listed herself as Native American. Did that affect her admission? Well, of course, the admissions office is to say no, but they have to say no. They can't say yes to that. Maybe it did, maybe it didn't. Harvard did tout her as an example of a Native American professor when they were asked about diversity among students and faculty. The spokesman, Mike Chumra, said, hey, professor of law Elizabeth Warren is Native American, right? So they certainly touted her as that. She also listed herself as a minority in the American Association of Law Schools directory. And she's contributed recipes to Native American cookbook called, I'm not joking, it's called Pow Wow Chow, 1984. And she signed her name, Elizabeth Warren Cherokee, which is oddly specific. But okay. So here we go. So Elizabeth Warren is now claiming that this is proof, right? 0.098% up to 1.5 or whatever. So in that range, this is now proof that she is indeed she's indeed Native American. By the way, I forgot to mention I'm calling this tea time because I've been drinking tea today every day around this time. It's snobby and British, but whatever. This is actually Chinese tea, but okay. So let's universalize this. And this is an easy one to universalize. So to universalize it, we just take the specifics and we turn them into abstracts. So the specific is Elizabeth Warren. Okay, so let's abstract that to all individuals, because this principle that you can have this amount of DNA and consider yourself that ethnicity, right, needs to be abstracted. So okay, well, so that means it's not just true for Elizabeth Warren; it needs to be true for everyone. That's the first level of abstraction. The next one we can do is say, well, it can't be just true for Native American ancestry. It has to be true for all ancestries, any ancestry, and any minority ancestry, because certainly she's not mostly Native American. So that's the process of going about it. So what do you conclude then? Well, the universal principle to apply here, according to Elizabeth, any person who, using a similar analysis can demonstrate that they possess between 0.098% and 1.56% genetic material from any specific genealogical group can claim membership in that group, and we all have to recognize that as a totally legitimate claim. Okay? Sounds a little bit, again, when you universalize, principles are often very abstract. So like I had to do with my daughter when she was young, now I can just say, oh, so the rule is blank, and I can say it abstractly, and she understands, what that means, and I don't have to give examples. But sometimes abstract rules are a little bit difficult to understand. So let's look at some examples. How would this be applied then? Right? Well, that means that since the average European American can claim to be 0.18% Native American, all European Americans can claim to be Native American. And what's even kind of more interesting to me is the average European American is also 0.19% African, which means all European Americans are now African Americans. We can all identify as African Americans. We can all call ourselves African Americans. We can all check off the box of African American. Employers can say they've got African American representation if you're a white person with 0.19%, which is the average of African genes. Now, obviously, this means no more affirmative action. You can say goodbye to that, which I'll bet Elizabeth Warren doesn't want. I'd be fine saying goodbye to affirmative action, but I bet the left wouldn't. It also means you got to get rid of all racial quotas from companies. No more complaining about how many Asians are at Google or black people are engineers at Facebook. Doesn't matter, because if we go by this standard, there are plenty of minorities in these companies. And it also means, California, that you can't complain about the prevalence of white people on boards or in executive roles or in positions of power, because as long as we've got little fraction of African or some other minority DNA in us, we are golden. Now, incidentally, one thing that I want to point out is when this article came out, it came out in the Boston Globe, this article about Elizabeth Warren's heritage. And I did a double take because they said she was 132nd Native American. And, I was a cryptographer in a previous life before being a venture capitalist, and now just a poor guy on the internet. I was okay at math, right? The math is pretty straightforward. It's 2 raised to the power of generations is the number that's the denominator. So if it's your grandparents, if it's your parents, it's 1/2. If it's your grandparents, it's 1/4, right? Their parents, 1/8. So, I read the report. 6, 2 to the 6th, right? It's 64. So it should be a 1/64th chance, up to 1 in 1024 chance. And Boston Globe later corrected this and said, "Oh, we made a math error." I actually I don't want to be a conspiracy theorist. I don't think that was I think that was intentional. I mean, I think they were just sloppy, right? Um, of course, they used the low end, or the better looking number, right? They could have said 1 in 512. Instead, they said 1 in 32, and then kind of in the article said, oh well, maybe 1 in 512. But I think they also just didn't care to check the math. They liked 1 in 32 sounds better than 1 in 64, so they went with that and then got caught. Maybe not, but certainly it's kind of a lame. It's a lame excuse. Like, oops, we screwed up the math. It's pretty basic math. Okay, so that's the Elizabeth Warren one. I think that's easy to universalize, and so that shouldn't be about Antifa. As I get more tea, so I got into kind of a Twitter war the other day. I didn't really do much. I said a couple things, and then I was piled on by a bunch of NPCs that were supporting Antifa. So decided to tweet every kind of insult at me they could. But one of the things that I said was, well, I said, hey, I know this is true. I know people who were beaten up and attacked for wearing the wrong hat. Now, they assumed I meant a MAGA hat. Actually, I was thinking of a friend of mine who was wearing a Make Bitcoin Great Again hat, which everyone interpreted as a MAGA hat. But the response was, it's okay to use physical violence against those people because that hat, this is a quote, that hat represents the rise of fascism in America. And so that's the claim, that the MAGA hat represents the rise of fascism. And since then, I've like I said earlier, I've started to read the Antifa handbook. Actually, they don't know what fascism is, or if they do, they don't care. In Antifa parlance, and this is not something I realized at the time, in Antifa parlance, fascism is anything that's not Marxist, basically. So they don't actually understand the difference between capitalism and fascism. In fact, even in the Antifa handbook, one of the guys, or the guy writing it, kind of makes this argument that, not an argument, he makes a comment that anarcho-capitalism is an oxymoron. And I think he really believes that. He doesn't understand what capitalism actually is. And I'm not going to get into that right now. But one thing that's evident so far from reading the book is that in Antifa parlance, anything that's not Marxism is fascism. Literally anything. So, but let's look at the real definition of fascism, right? So fascism, this is Merriam-Webster, right? There's a bunch of components to it. It's any one of these. The centralization of authority under a dictator. Okay. Stringent socioeconomic controls. Okay. Suppression of the opposition through terror and censorship. And a policy of belligerent nationalism. And again, fascism, I think the reason that the Antifa folks believe that anything that's not communist is fascist is because the anti-fascist, the Antifa movement arose out of fighting. It was basically arose out of communists fighting fascists in Europe, right? So in their mind, there was only two sides. It was like, Stalin or Mussolini, we go for Stalin, right? So that's why that's kind of their mentality. But so obviously, I don't think that the MAGA hat represents the rise of fascism as they do, but we can assume it does. And by the way, I think it's pretty obvious to demonstrate that it doesn't represent the rise of fascism because Trump's a pragmatist. He's not a principled anything, really. He's just kind of a pragmatist. I don't like a lot of stuff he does, but the guy's not. He's not a principled anything, right? He doesn't really speak fascism. He speaks gruffly and says things, but he doesn't. There's no unified principled vision coming from Trump. So anyway, so their argument is that supporting the rise of fascism, or in their minds, capitalism, which is fascism in their minds. That in and of itself is the initiation of force, right? So the argument here that Antifa's making, and they really believe this, and I didn't realize how much they believed it until I started to read this book, but their argument is that the the actual support of any, quote, fascist ideology, and again, any non-Marxist ideology. So supporting a non-Marxist ideology is in and of itself the initiation of force, and therefore anything they do to you is self-defense. That is their honest to God belief, and they don't hide it. Right? It's funny because when you talk about other groups with them, you'll ask to show that they're fascists, and they'll say, "Well, they're hiding this and they're hiding that," and of course they wouldn't come out and say it, right? But Antifa certainly comes out and says exactly what they mean and think. So, and universalize it. So, for the sake of this argument, to universalize that, I'm not going to get into whether the MAGA hat represents fascism or not. It doesn't. Let's take their word for it. Let's pretend that it does. Well, what do we have to generalize? Well, we have to generalize away from just fascism, right? Because fascism is kind of a specific form of government. So we'd have to say, well, this can't be true just for fascism, but any form of violence or oppressive government, right? So, again, yeah, that's just true for Mussolini and Hitler, but it also has to be true for Mao and Stalin and anyone on the left as well, any oppressive government, right? So any advocacy, and let's go through the list of so any advocacy of any one of these things would have to be included, right? Centralization of authority. Well, that's certainly communism fits that definition, right? Whether it's one dictator or a party of dictators is really irrelevant. It's the centralization of authority. You can't argue that China is not centralized authority, right? So communism certainly meets that definition. Stringent economic controls. I mean, it's like what the left is, right? Stringent economic controls. So, okay, meets that definition. Suppression of the opposition through terror and censorship. Well, hang around Antifa for 5 minutes and you'll recognize that there is no one more adamant about suppressing opposition through terror and censorship than Antifa, the Marxist communists. Nationalism is another aspect of the definition of fascism. Now, of course, that's more of a right-wing thing. So the communism tends to be more globalist. And then racism, which I would argue is more of a left-wing thing. But of course, they've redefined racism to mean power plus racism, which is a weird definition. Communists typically are about class bigotry rather than race bigotry, right? So, but we can extend this to bigotry in general, right? So, okay, so if we abstract that away, we get this kind of thought that, okay, any propaganda or any support of a government ideology that has any of these components falls into the same category as a MAGA hat, right? And not to blow your mind a little bit, but as an anarcho-capitalist, which is not an oxymoron, by the way, Antifa, but as an anarcho-capitalist, I would actually argue that the government is, by definition, a monopoly on the use of force, and any advocacy for the expansion of power of the government is an advocacy for violence. So you could actually throw any kind of advocacy for government expansion of power in the same abstract concept. I realize that's a little bit much for some people, so I'm not gonna expand it for the purpose of this generalization. I won't. We'll just leave it to include fascism and communism. Okay, so what's the standard that we've got here, right? There's not really a process for deciding whether an ideology constitutes a violent political philosophy, since all political ideologies other than anarcho-capitalism actually do advocate some level of the use of force by the state. And roughly half the voters voted for Trump. So there's not really a standard here. So again, this is now based on interpretation. All right, so again, when we're abstracting out of here, so it can't be just a hat that stands for fascism. It has to be like a hat that stands for kind of any government violence and expansion, all those things I just listed, which includes a lot of all communist and Marxist governments. And then we have to abstract away from a hat, right? It can't just be about a hat, right? You can't say, well, the hats are bad, but shirts aren't, right? So it can't just be a hat with a slogan. It's going to be any overt support of anything that might be construed by the people reading or interpreting it as supporting government violence. Okay? So that means, well, wearing a shirt with a phrase or picture on it, advocating for voting for a candidate who wants to, let's say, add a regulation, right? That's government violence. Tweeting, making a speech, expressing any kind of opinion that's pro-Marxist, communist, socialist, regardless of the form, right? And then we have to abstract from not just beating up people. So we're abstracted the type of offense they have, right? They're offended at fascism. We've extracted the method of the medium through which the offense was, which is the hat. We've extracted that to any support. And now we have to abstract away what they said you can basically beat people up or attack people. Well, what's the abstraction of that? Well, if it's okay to initiate force under the assumption that the other person is advocating murder for you, then there's really no stopping you from escalating to murder. So punching is just an arbitrary form of physical violence. You could absolutely justify killing people as well. We can look at terms, but it's basically an attempted murder. So the conclusion here, let's universalize this thing. Again, this is a little bit messier than universalizing Elizabeth Warren's Pocahontas claims. Okay, so expressing even any kind of cursory or tacit support, right? Like a hat, a thing, right? Expressing any kind of tacit support for anything that someone might interpret as supporting violence, specifically government violence. We kind of limited it here, and I even excluded some of the, I didn't say all government violence. I'm just kind of saying Marxist and fascist. So expressing any kind of tacit support for anything that might be interpreted as supporting violent government is the same as violence. And therefore, the person who interprets that as violence is justified in using force against you. And there's no reason that there's a constraint against that so they can kill you. So that's the principle that that Antifa is arguing for. So how does that affect Antifa and the rest of us? Well, let's see some examples of how this might be then applied. Again, remember I was talking how I applied things with my daughter. We have to go universal, and then it's hard to understand what that means. We have to give concretes of how that universal principle is then reapplied in another situation. Okay, well, let's talk about Antifa's favorite thing, communism. Communism killed 100 million people last century. Way more than fascism. So this means that if we apply this principle that Antifa has set up explicitly, then we can beat up or kill anyone who calls themselves a Marxist or communist, which includes all Marxist professors, all of Antifa, basically. They're fair game. Anyone who reads or promotes or sells communist manifesto or communist propaganda, fair game to kill or beat up. Anyone who wears ANCOM lapel pins, which is anarcho-communism, which I actually think is an oxymoron, but that's another episode. Antifa wears those. Totally fine to attack them. You can also just beat up the guy that wears the Che Guevara t-shirt, apparently, because Che Guevara was a bloody monster, and certainly his support of communist government in Cuba falls under the same universal principle. So, and obviously, if you're someone who understands that all government is the initiation of the use of force, you actually then could use this principle to basically attack anyone who advocates for any increase in government power whatsoever, wears a flag of any country, all that stuff. So obviously that's ridiculous. We don't want to live in a society like that. And in the Enlightenment, and Enlightenment thinkers, Enlightenment philosophers taught us that, hey, applied and still have any kind of sane society, it's not a good idea, right? I'm paraphrasing. Obviously, there's more philosophic rigor to to John Locke's arguments and that kind of thing. But look, if those are the rules that Antifa wants, then we should apply them universally. And if we apply them universally, it is utter chaos. It's just civil war. That's all it is. which is horrible. Obviously, I don't think we should apply those universally, because I think it's a horrible, horrible principle. And is by doing what we just did, you abstract it and reapply it. Okay, so the final one I'm going to talk about. I might do a bonus one here based on something that happened, but the final one is Hillary Clinton. She said, and this is actually a little bit easier, I think, to abstract out and universalize and reapply. She said, I'm sure a lot of people saw this interview. She said, quote, "You cannot be civil with a political party that wants to destroy what you stand for, what you care about." A statement. Well, we don't even have to universalize Republicans because she didn't say that. She said it's already all political parties. What they want to destroy what you stand for and what you care about, or what you care about. Well, she was speaking in the context of Democrats and what she cares about and what the left cares about. But universalizing this out, everyone has something they stand for or even just care about, right? Some political party, there's something about where there's some political party who wants to destroy what they care about, right? For a lot of conservative Christians, it would be abortion. That for abortion, right? If it's the people on so let's say pro-military, right? The left wants to destroy the military, right? Or cut it back. If it's people want to cut taxes, well, the left wants to increase taxes. So the left wants to destroy just as much as the right does when you're talking about just listing things that people care about. So whether you're far right or far left, it doesn't really matter, or anywhere in between. Destroy really just means is against politically. It means like, make political moves against, right? And directly advocating violence, but she certainly means things like shouting at people in restaurants and that kind of thing, to give her a generous interpretation. And there's one other thing I want to point out about her statement, which we can universalize. She did not say you don't have to be civil, or you cannot be civil. Right? So she's saying it's impossible to be civil, right? You must harass someone, a political party, who has different opinions than yours. So what does this look like? Well, to be again, harass, be rude to, kick out of restaurants, whatever. Right? You can be uncivil to anyone whose political opinion differs from yours. This is easy. About half the population, therefore, should be uncivil all the time because one half is in power half the time and the other half is not. So we're now entering an era, according to Hillary Clinton, where I'll be horribly uncivil to each other no matter who's in power, because if that principle is applied universally, obviously, if the Democrats are in power, Republicans can be assholes back to the Democrats. So let's see what this might look like applied in some specifics. Well, it means that Republicans should not have been polite to Christine Blasey Ford at all, because she was trying to destroy something they stood for, which was Kavanaugh's confirmation, and actually also the presumption of innocence, right, and due process. So they should not have been polite to Christine Blasey Ford at all. Republicans, libertarians, anyone who feels threatened by what they care about, or feels that what they care about is threatened by the Democrats, but must, with Warren, all these people, right? It's pretty obvious. Taking this concept and universalizing it and then reapplying it really creates a dystopian society. And this is super, super common. Democrats, more, but again, they don't think in terms of universal principles. right? Because they have been trained by postmodernists who they don't think in terms of universal principles. They don't think when I say believe all women, what does that actually mean applied? They just say whatever they need to win the argument in the moment. Whatever magic words work, that's what they're saying. But we need to train our people. We need to show other people and train ourselves to be able to abstract into universal principles and then them not the kind to live in that we want to live in. I certainly don't want to live in that society. And I think most rational, reasonable people, moderates out there, don't want to live in a society ruled by the universe Clinton articulated. So as a bonus, one other thing I thought I'd quickly talk about, because it was funny today, Trump tweeted that Stormy Daniels has a horse face. Actually ended up having to go look up pictures of Stormy Daniels. It was a horrible, horrible job. I don't know, I guess a little bit, but I'm not going to say she's bad looking. The question is, so obviously people got upset about this presidential. He said she had a horse face. But Trump is just universalizing. Now, look, Trump, so I'm not suggesting this is actually his thought process, but you could justify this by simply doing what we just did, universalizing and then reapplying, right? What has the left been mocking about Trump for years now, right? His looks, his hair, his orange skin. What did Stormy Daniels mock about Trump? She mocked his penis and what it looks like and how big it is or shape or whatever, right? So his physical attributes have been made fair game by the left for years now, right? So all Trump really has to be Trump and come up with this stuff like horse face. He could just simply, right, abstract those attacks against him, universalize them, and reapply them, right? End up at the same conclusion. He would start looking at Stormy Daniels and trying to pick on her. So, and I think, one thing I think that's important for us to, and when I say us, I'm not talking to conservative anarcho-capitalism, although shout out if you are an anarcho-capitalist. I'm talking about anyone who's not a Marxist, basically. Anyone who wants to not live in the Antifa dystopia that is being foisted on us, right? These kind of arguments that are thrown around, we need to demonstrate to everyone else, look, this is how you universalize and what they're actually arguing for. Hillary Clinton is not arguing for only Democrats should be uncivil. She to be uncivil to anyone that they don't like. Antifa is arguing that everyone should be able to shoot and punch and beat up anyone who disagrees with them, basically, right? And anyone who disagrees with anyone else, basically. Anyone who can claim that there's some violence inherent in a political position someone takes, right? Fair game. Elizabeth Warren is not claiming some special status as a Native American. She is claiming that no one has any, because everyone basically fits into some definition of minority based on the numbers that she's using, right? So that's the being that's being proposed by the left. And for some of us, I know for some of it's easier to see than others, but some of us it's a little bit harder. And I think we need to practice it, which is what I want to do every Tuesday at 4 during tea time. With if you've got other ideas for things that we should talk about. If I made an error somewhere, point it out. I did a bad job universalizing and reapplying. But it's a practice that I think we can all get better at. I'm not perfect. There's some things, like I said, are easy, like all women, and some things are a little bit more nuanced. So thanks for watching. To end, you can follow or subscribe. You can follow us on Twitter at UnsafeShow, or you can subscribe at unsafeshow.com. Or please also, if you're not already, starting to build slowly building an audience and talking about this important stuff. And would love to have interaction and feedback from everyone. So thanks again. Have a great day and enjoy the rest of tea time. Take care, everyone.